Okay. There you go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Tales of Cape Cod Summer Lecture Series. Hello, I recognize some of your faces, and some of you are new to me. My name is Nancy Richard, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Tales of Cape Cod, and it's my privilege to welcome you all tonight to hear tonight's program, and I'm here to introduce our guest speaker. For a complete list of this year's speakers, please be sure to pick up a copy at the door. We've got a program listing. And for those of you who are not members, we encourage you to complete an application, which is also available at the door. Since Tales of Cape Cod is a small, all-volunteer nonprofit organization, we appreciate the support of our members and attendees at our speaker program. Your membership dues and donations tonight help us to maintain this 1770s historic building, the Olde Colonial Courthouse, as well as bring you outstanding speakers like Bob Frazee, who's over here. Please visit our website, talesofcapecod.org, for more information about our history and our programs. And we are grateful to the Bank of Cape Cod for its generous donation to support our annual speaker program. Please join us for desserts, thanks to Jude Martin, after the program. And I'm pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Bob Frazee. The subject of his talk is the history of the Olde Courthouse and other buildings in Barnstable Village. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a bio on Bob so that you know who he is. He was born in Dedham, and one of his first and favorite recollections as a young boy was playing at the historic Fairbanks house where his mother occasionally volunteered as a docent. How many of you got tagged along when your parents took you places like that? Right, you're all laughing. According to well-known architectural historian Abbott Lowell Cummings, Fairbanks House is the holy grail of first-period houses in America, a great place to start being interested in old buildings. And because of this, we're benefiting from that experience. In 1966, he moved to Cape Cod with his family, first to Chatham and then to Osterville in 1973. His brother started a small marine specialties business. In the mid-'80s, he began a career as an innkeeper, first managing the front office for the Daniel Webster and Sandwich, and then restoring a historic home in Barnstable Village that he and his wife operated as a licensed bed and breakfast. That bed and breakfast was in the Henry Crocker house, which is right in the village, across from here. Let's see. He's always been actively involved with many historical organizations, contributing a broad understanding of the intricacies of operating small historical nonprofits. We know all about that. And of managing the historic resources with which they are so often associated. He's the past president of the Marston's Mills Historical Society, a member of the advisory board of the Osterville Historical Society, and chairman of the advisory board at the Cape Cod Maritime Museum in Hyannis. He's been an activist for preservation of a number of threatened historical resources in Barnstable over time, including Osterville's Camet House, the town-owned Burgess House, and Cape Cod Airfield, both in Marston's Mills. He's been working closely with the Barnstable Land Trust in an attempt to have them preserve and rehabilitate the farmhouse on the old Fuller Farm on 149 as their permanent headquarters. And let's see. This lecture today will take a fresh look at the courthouse based on very recent collaborative investigations involving several Tales of Cape Cod board members, as well as specialists in historical research. Excuse me, now I'm starting to lose my groove here. Above all, the building itself has been closely observed, particularly the exposed roof timbers in the attic and the crawl areas around the foundations. We've made some very interesting discoveries. And there are going to be possibly some long-standing questions answered about how and when various portions of the building were built or modified. We really hope that you'll enjoy this lecture and enjoy the marvelous building. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Bob Frazee.
Thank you.
And don't fall.
I'll try not to. see if I can learn the technology correctly here. Thank you all for coming out on a lovely summer night. Bless you. I think I quite possibly know about 80% of the audience, which is rather amazing too. Anyway, it's neat to see you. Special thanks up front to some of the folks who helped on this project over the last few months. Kevin Ryan and Gene Gill and Dave Munsell, Mary LaBombard, also from Cape Cod Community College, who I think is here. Anyway, who helped with some consulting work, and some folks from the Sturgis Library, Marilyn Fuller from Barnstable Historical Society as well. We've done a mixture of investigative research of the traditional kind and the kind that was mentioned in the preamble to the lecture of crawling around under the building and getting up in the attic and chasing the pejorative bats and weasels and other things that you might expect to find in dark, creepy places, but we didn't find any.
Excuse me, Bob, could you talk into the mic? We're not hearing you back.
Is that better at all? Maybe I should I'll just stand next to this. That's fine for now. That's perfectly fine. Anyway, what I'd like to do to start with is run through a few slides that are of structures that I've been familiar with and worked on a number of years, actually for a number of years, as kind of a preamble to understanding buildings themselves as a primary research resource, which is often overlooked. People frequently think of going to a library or an archives, but in my experience, the real test and the real truth comes from actually thumping around the building itself and spending some real time doing it over a period of years. Very often you learn things from the second, third, and fourth look that you don't notice the first time. The three up here at the moment are Goodspeed House, which is one of the oldest that I have worked with, which is on River Road in Marston's Mills. Actually, I did a research document for it at Roger Williams University a number of years ago, and its date was originally thought to be the Goodspeed House from 1650. It is not that. It belongs to the son of Roger Goodspeed, Ebenezer. It was built between 1685 and 1710. And Henry Crocker House, which was mentioned in the preamble right across the street, having lived there for a while, I got pretty close and personal with some of its features and a couple of things that I thought would be interesting to show you there. And then Burgess House in Marston's Mills, which is the headquarters of the Marston's Mills Village Association on Route 149, is an 1823 transitional federal farmhouse that has some very interesting features in it, again, from doing decorative finishes analysis and some other research there. Is there an on-off button for this? No. Oh, wait a minute here. It needed me nearer. That's what it needed. All right. Good. Fantastic. Thank you. This is just a quick look at Burgess House. And Jim Gould, who's a historian many of you may be familiar with from Katuitt, who's a good friend of mine. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm still hoping this thing was going to do it. Excuse me. Do you think this one might? Yeah. I'm willing to try. Is that better? Yes. Ooh, all right. Thank you. We crawled around in this for several days at the invitation of a former owner, Joe Moraney, who used to be the clarinetist for the Louis Armstrong Quartet. And he'd owned it for a bunch of years and knew it was a very valuable treasure and invited us to see what we could think about it. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that in order to ascertain the order in which different units of the building were developed and when and to date them, you look hard at the timbers, you look hard at the tool marks, you look at the order in which things seem to have occurred, and then see if you can make sense of it. In this case, we were able to identify the occurrence of the first addition to the building. Originally, it was just a two-room house. It was 3 bays wide and two bays deep. And the second unit, the one to the left, is only 1 bay deep. It's only a one-room addition, which is kind of unusual. And we could see on the second floor two features that were unique to this property. One is that it's a 1.5-story facade, which is very rare. There are a couple here in Barnstable Village, and many years ago, Candace Jenkins, working as a consultant for the Barnstable Historical Commission, tied together the history of this building with actually the 1644 Sturgis Library building as a part of the same kind of construction. The head on the building post right here is double and triple thickness, and it's because rising as high as it does in the building, it has to have enough meat in it to make numerous complex joints before it's finished doing its work. At this location here, the tie beam was actually sawn off in order to create an access opportunity for the addition at the attic level, not the first level. Well, I'll get the hang of this thing eventually. One of the other opportunities at Goodspeed House was...
I'm going to fix your mic.
Oh, thank you.
I think the people in the back aren't hearing you very well.
Sorry about that.
See if I can get it off your collar. Good. Okay. Sorry. Okay, now try it.
Does that work for anybody? Haha, fantastic. Thank you very much, Nancy. Next time I'll know better. They offer me one of these. I will. They offer me one of these things on the bus tour that I narrate for the town twice a year, and it never works, which is why I'm not too good at it. The Goodspeed House was also an artifact-rich property. We didn't do archaeology on it ourselves, but the previous owner had collected things the whole time he'd been there. And this is just an interesting little sample of some of the artifacts that he'd turned up. Anytime this is possible, it creates a kind of an intensity of interest about the building on the part of the owners and any visitors or other people interested in investigating it. Henry Crocker House across the street from me here. After years of speculation and waiting, I think it was the year before we left there, whoops, oh dear, a crack opened right underneath the stairway, confirming the location of what we had always felt was an earlier, much steeper staircase, because this one was certainly a 19th century alteration. And first year there, stripping shingles off, the first course of shingles revealed that it's not a vertically sheathed building, it's a horizontally sheathed building. Typically, one thinks of horizontal sheathing as being a more recent type of construction. It's not always true. Burgess House, which you'll see in a minute, is a later building than this by almost a decade and a half and is vertically sheathed. So you have to pay attention to the context of things as well. And then in the barn, we were watching a couple of the principal posts, which were huge, disappearing gradually down through the floor. And we were not too keen on letting that continue. We hired a contractor to come and lift the back of the building up to take the post's weight up. And with 4 40-ton jacks, they kept jacking and jacking and jacking, and the thing that they were in contact with that had been giving way under them stayed in full contact with them as they rose. They kept having to re-crib the jacks so they could raise it. And finally we realized it was a ship's timber. And what was happening was that the spring and the camber of the deck timber was still live, and it was still trying to rise and meet the removing of the beam. This kind of thing happens all the time in old houses where you have materials that are reused from other sources. And also at Henry Crocker House, I mean, one of the things we did clearly was strip off the door. And this is really common experience. Maybe some of you have had it when you take an old door down to bare wood and try to restore it. You start to see the ghosting of the earlier hardware on it. And it's like a little roadmap to the story of that door and sometimes to the building itself. In this case, it was an interesting dynamic between the number of changes that had clearly taken place with the locking and latching hardware and apparently only one door knocker opening. And it was a dead perfect match for the one that was still with the building when we bought it, which I hope is still there, John. I think it is. There we go. Burgess House in Marston's Mills, built around 1823, was the subject of a decorative finishes analysis that I did back in the 1990s as the town was initially dissuaded from bulldozing it, and a group of local villagers from Marston's Mills moved in to try and look after it and rescue it. And the objective here was to essentially do archaeology with paint, if you want to think of it that way. And using a scalpel, you crater through all the paint layers right down to the substrate, and then smooth it off with olive oil, and then inspect it under a 10-power lens using a ring of light that's at about 500 degrees Kelvin, which is essentially sunlight temperature. So it's a light temperature frequency that you're looking for. And you enumerate all of the layers of paint you see, you write them down, you make a list, and you describe them according to a set standard. The standard that we used for this, which was easy to use, was the Benjamin Moore historic paint samples, or paint cards. I think in the field, in a professional setting more often, you might find people using the Munsell color cards, which are the same things you use as an archaeologist doing soil samples, soil colors. But eventually you compare the layers from one location to another location. In this case, I picked this slide just because they're very different at that sample and that one. And it's just the interface between two rooms. And this funny little spot was a linchpin of understanding the development of Burgess House and when additions were made, and a really important decorative finishes development occurred in the 1830s when it was federalized with some additions on the outside, but more particularly a lot of the interior features were changed. In the turn of the century, a builder architect by the name of Asher Benjamin was profusely published, and his architect's books became a resource for builders and carpenters all over the country, especially out in rural areas, and they would look at his designs and they would copy them. And the south parlor trim at Burgess House is essentially a primitive but very real copy of these profiles in all cases, and it was kind of a cool discovery to see that. We had a person working on the building who was grabbing doors off their hinges and taking them across the street and putting a belt sander on them, which made me cringe for any one of a number of reasons. But when you're working on a preservation project, sometimes husbanding the energy of your volunteers is as important as guiding them too closely. And so I kind of did a little dance with him. And he kind of got the hang of what I was interested in pretty shortly. And the next thing I knew, he came across the street with these two doors. And the door to the right is the older door from either from the beginning of the building's date of 1823 or maybe even from an older building. And there were several of them just like this with sponge decoration paint on the panels. They're 4-panel door. They're thin. They're much thinner than the newer one to the left here. They have smaller, lighter duty hardware, which is older. The larger door would have had, again, we're back to looking for ghosting of hardware on it. That was revealed by his sanding endeavors. They had box locks on them that were a very much more modern feature than the old lift latches that had been on the rest of the building. And so this contributed to our understanding of that south parlor as a very important change in the development of the building. Ooh, I like what this is doing. Now, we come to the courthouse, and you're all here already, which is great. When Alex and I lived here, we lived in that lovely gray house on the left. And we were open for business, and there was a sign out front, and we expected company and people asking questions, and they did pretty often. And I have lots of funny stories I won't tell you about now, but afterwards. But one of the common questions was right there. They would come right up on the front lawn, and 30 yards from where we're sitting right now, they'd say, "Excuse me, where's the courthouse?" And I think we all know why. I mean, a little bit. It doesn't look like a courthouse anymore, and it hasn't for 172 years, which is fine. But it's one of those things. It's a difficult interpretive conundrum for Tales and for the organizations that have sustained it all these years. And clearly, when the Third Baptist Society obtained the structure in 1842, they began transforming it into a church. And very shortly on, it became a traditional-looking New England church. There we go. These footprints are drawn in the past year or so as part of the conditions assessment survey that's underway to determine what needs to be done for the building for its ongoing sustenance. I use plans like this all the time just as a way of understanding the layout of a building and how it developed. I'm not so interested in the individual labels on the pieces as I am about, so when did this piece happen and when did that piece happen and how do they fit together? And essentially think of it as a 2-story building, and it's a building within a building. We're all sitting cheerfully in the old Colonial Courthouse right now, and we all kind of know that, but sometimes it's easy to forget. In gray, that is what that is, with the first floor where we are to the left, and the gallery and the crown vaulted ceiling to the right. I wonder if I just skipped an extra slide here, possibly. Well, I should have, but I didn't. There we go. Some of the features that are present in the building that have been noted under the surveys, but that we've all seen as we've been crawling around, are vestiges of earlier utility systems that were brought here in the first place. In the Third Baptist Society's own history, and there's a very nice one written in 1927 that we've been able to obtain and research with, the first electricity was brought into the house in 1919, which followed a major renovation here and the 1905 addition of the parish hall and the bell tower and kitchen and second floor apartment. And there is an abundance of this knob and tube wiring, which is kind of charming and quirky. I'm thinking as time goes on, less and less of it is used and energized, and that's a good thing. But we certainly saw a great deal of it, and it's just kind of cool to this building built as a courthouse, and you'll see pictures later that'll help make this more convincing. Built as a courthouse was really a pretty cool and elegant structure in its earliest state, and some care was taken with it that I think might surprise people today. Hopping all around here. This picture came to me from several sources, including John Temple, and I believe it appears in a 1930s paperback that many of you are familiar with, but it's just a lovely rural image of the same era for the church, for Third Baptist Church, and also Henry Crocker House on the left with a very different treescape. And I'm sure this is before the turn of the 20th century. I don't know exactly when. John, do you have any thoughts about? No? Okay. I'm thinking maybe the 1870s or something like that would be about. Bless you.
You might forget the age and size of the trees.
Well, if the trees were still there, we could do something with that. Those were long gone before I got here, I know. There we go. With thanks to Gene Gill, who began working with me on this, or I with him. I'm not sure how this worked out. We're a pretty good team. We started trying to work our mindset back to the early courthouse. And we're talking about building form, building shape, building size. Lots of questions about it. There are some presumptions that have been made, if that's the right word, over the decades about where it was, where it is, was it moved, was it turned, were the entrances the same, was it added onto, was it a smaller building, et cetera. And with an eye towards eventually addressing those kinds of questions, we decided to do really primitive sketches that are roughly to scale. Not exactly, but roughly to scale, at least getting the proportions right, and then trying to compare the two eras of the building. So this is clearly the post-1842 church. And this is the courthouse. It's exactly the same size. It's 3 bays wide. It is a tall story and a half. It has a tall roof. It has a central cupola. I'll talk to you about the little arrow on top in a moment, but we won't go there yet. It was a hip roof structure, and it had a covered central entry porch that faced the Old Kings Highway. The ghosting of gray, tall material there is an indication of, in this case here, the support posts of the building, right there, and there, and there, and there, okay? And from the plate or the eaves upwards, they're not posts from there, they're very elaborate trusses that suspend the roof and hold the ceiling. And one of the great revelations to me, and I think to my compatriots when we were crawling around in the attic, was we were absolutely astonished with a couple of the truss constructions that we found up there, and I've never seen anything like them. And I have some photographs to show you about that as well. But they relate to a time when there was an effort to build this as a courthouse with a clear area to meet, a clear hall without any support posts in the middle. You know, think of a stadium where you get stuck behind a pillar. That wasn't going to happen here in the court. And these trusses contribute mightily to that being possible. And at the time, a hip roof structure was not only the fashionable Georgian thing to do in pre-revolutionary era American colonies, but it was also a much stronger structure. It did not have some of the issues that you get when you enlarge the ridge of the roof and have it stand up straight on the ends. These are the two compared closely, and this is really what we're trying to get to. As an 1842 church, the hip is now a fully gabled roof. There are special trusses that I just mentioned, and we'll show them to you later. The enclosed entry porch has been removed and replaced by a window. Oops, I forget which thing I'm pointing with, I'm sorry. Wow. That window. That's what I was trying to do. A new double entry on the west gable end, which we saw in the pictures of the 1850s church. The building, in my opinion, and I think my compatriots agree, does not show any evidence of having been turned or enlarged. It was a three-bay structure to begin with. It's a three-bay structure to this day. It's just that the facade was changed by changing the openings, basically. And, you know, if we think about the terminology, the parlance of the day, turning the building, it was a little bit like turning your countenance, not turning your whole body. I think that there are several ways semantically to interpret the term, but I don't believe the building was moved. And the original brick and stone foundation, as near as I can see, remains intact under it. Has a few challenges, but not anything terribly severe. And, you know, in 1850 and on, it began a life looking, as for all the world, like a traditional New England church. And it has a very well-documented history. Prior to that, the old Colonial Courthouse, and you may notice I've got a new date up there. I'll explain later. It's a theory, it's not a fact, but I think we've had a very interesting discovery in the course of this. It had, as I said, a very tall hip roof, special trusses, enclosed entry porch, facade facing the Old Kings Highway, a well-raised foundation, which was another tradition of Georgian architecture typically, a centered cupola. We believe it probably had a bell. There's a chance that it had a statue of Justice on top of the cupola, which is what that arrow up at the tippy top is about. We're not sure about that. We're also not sure if it had one that we've been looking at recently, but there's a good chance it did. And it was a classic Georgian-style courthouse, which is typical of the colonies at the same time that they are found in Virginia and in the South in brick. They were often found in wood timber frame here in New England. And this same building is really one that was documented by Gustavus Hinckley in the 1880s in his sketchbooks, which we have been able to access through the courtesy of the W.B. Nickerson collection at the Community College. And we'll get to that in a moment. This is a carved statue of Justice that is in the collection of the Shelburne Museum in Shelburne, Vermont. And the provenance they claim for it in their accession sheet, their catalog record, is that it was associated with this building and that it was acquired by them in 1950 after many years of no one really quite thinking much about it or knowing where it was. And looking into, as much as we can, the fuzzy past history of it between when the building ceased being a courthouse and began being a church, is the theory has it that one or two of the individuals doing work on the building kind of adopted the statue. Nobody seemed to know what to do with it. And it passed down through their families for some time and eventually found its way to Shelburne. Where and how it could have been used on this building, we're not sure. It was very difficult to negotiate. Gene Gill was heroic in doing so, but I'll have this available for people to see it at the break at the end. But we had the statue at Shelburne professionally photographed, and then through the assistance of a local photographer and artist, it was photoshopped to remove the background from its exhibit location, and we were able to play with it a little bit to see how it would have conceivably fit into life here on our building. Now, the full-fledged drawing of the statue or photo of the statue doesn't work very compatibly with the stick figure of the building, but this again is about scale and proportion. And I leave it to you as beholders to wonder to yourselves whether this was possible or likely. I can tell you that such things did exist in the world in the time of this building's construction as a courthouse. They very often had very tall cupolas with small domes on them, and they either had monstrously huge weather vanes, or they very often had, if they were courthouses, statues of justice. This particular one is 10 feet tall, and that is a large justice. And I have a little bit of trouble putting that on top of a building that was not a large-scale structure. But I really like the idea. And I told you, I'm not going to do it tomorrow. Well, Gene already did it. See, it worked out great. But it's one of the mysteries that we uncovered in the course of looking at the structure. You know, there's a folk tradition or an oral tradition, if you will, of the history of the statue itself that associates it with the courthouse. And we're darned if we can figure out how that would be so, if not this way. And hopefully that's something that can be subject of further research. These are a couple of brick courthouses from the period, well, particularly the one above, which is the one from Colonial Williamsburg. If you remove 2 bays, one off each end, and take the pediment off here, it's not terribly difficult to envision our courthouse as Gustavus Hinckley drew it in the 1880s. And note the extraordinarily tall cupola, which was a common thing in the colonies at that time. This one here from Greenfield, Wisconsin is a copy. But the point is that it was copying a colonial tradition, and they did it. It was a very conscious effort. And small-scale buildings with these kinds of proportions were not uncommon at that time. And if you thought of taking a little of the cupola down and adding a 10-foot statue, you still end up with a very similarly tall building at its center is really the only point there. And I'm not going to belabor that, but that's just where that's coming from. The Gustavus Hinckley collection is something that perhaps many of you already know about. In 1983, a good friend of mine and Alex's spent several years transcribing by hand all of the images in several bank books, which were the media into which Mr. Hinckley had sketched and made notes about the historic buildings of Barnstable Village, where he grew up and that he loved. And Eben Johnson is his name. I spoke with him a couple of days ago about this. His objective was to make it so that people could research and use the documents without having to handle them and damage them, but also to help interpret some of the handwriting and thereby transcribe below what is written in hand in the image above. And that is actually pretty helpful if you've done any of this kind of research. It can drive you crazy sometimes trying to figure out what people have said. In addition, though we don't know who the, not culprit, but helpful soul was, in the margins there are notes in pencil through many, many pages of these books, all in the same hand, it seems to me anyway, where someone has been endeavoring to ascribe locations on the Old Kings Highway by street number to some of the images in the books. Now, this is a lot of it back of the napkin kind of drawing. This is not high-scale architectural drafting or anything of the sort. The buildings and locales appear in a fairly random way through the books. They're not in sequence. He didn't walk up the street and do them one by one or anything, which makes it a little bit confusing as a resource to use. But I don't think we could be any luckier than to find something like that drawing of this courthouse, which he knew intimately and chose to draw in this fashion for posterity. These are the originals. Again, thanks to Mary LeBombard from the community college for scanning these for me. But on the left is one of the pages from one of his books where he's done a real napkin job on the building. It's just very casual, but the concept is there. I mean, you have everything we've just talked about, although this looks more like a pyramidal roof. He didn't really get the ridge in it. You know, there's definitely a cupola. There's definitely something that looks like a bell in it. It's definitely a hipped roof. Definitely is a 3-bay building facing the direction of its enclosed entry porch. And it's identified as this courthouse. He identifies it as a courthouse built in 1774, which is the conventional wisdom, though not the universal one by any means. Some people feel it was 1772. But right around that time, and obviously with virtually infamous results in terms of the actions in the times leading up to the revolution, which I think most of you are aware of. This is the other book, and this one is committed in pen and ink, which is a much more precise drawing and shows a lot more of a Georgian style structure. More casual drawings in the one below are typical of his house drawings. But just thinking about how small scale this one was as a structure, he spent a lot of time on it compared to some of the others. This is a close-up of it. And if you kind of work it from the top down, you know, is that justice on top? Who knows? Is it someone with an outstretched arm? Or is it a weather vane? Who knows? I mean, really, it's just, we can't be sure. It does, again, look to me like there's a bell in the belfry. It is a hip-roof structure. It is 3 bays wide. And has an enclosed front entry porch. It is on a raised brick foundation. In this case, it has windows that are very Georgian. They're round-headed, multi-paned. They have shutters that, when closed, match the roundness of the window head, although he actually didn't draw them correctly. He was trying to. And you see a pathway down from the door indicating that there was a downslope from the building's location, to me suggesting that it was still and or already upgrade from the Old Kings Highway and the parade ground. And even you can stretch your imagination a little bit and say, well, people laugh at me, but you know, who's to say that that is not representing a dentelated cornice, which with the Greek dentils is a very common Georgian architectural feature, a very simple one, but one that tremendously decorates buildings from the period. Getting into the nitty-gritty of the building, quite literally, from one of our crawl-arounds or two, we started looking at the structure. And this is where things like this get fascinating to me. I don't know if there are many people in the room who think nothing about jumping through hatches and floors and crawling around in the dirt with spiders and critters, but what you get to see is the bones of a building, and you get to look at stuff that nobody else has seen probably in years, except maybe a furnace repair guy if he lived through it. And what I want you to see is how the floor system that you're sitting on right now works. And if you bear with me for just a sec, I'm sorry, this turned out a little blurrier than I had in mind, but we're dealing with a building that is 30 feet from corner to corner across the ends, 33 feet across the long side. Off to the right-hand end is the addition from 1905. We're for now just ignoring that because we're thinking about the courthouse. The big picture above lines up the major trusses with the major posts. And these are where the major posts are, there and there. The red dots are the major posts. There are 2 in each gable end wall. There's one right here, one right here, and back in the rear gallery where the sound makers are, there's another one. And in fact, when you are up in the front of the room later on this evening, if you look up there, you'll see that the posts at that end are supporting the plate, the massive beam that connects the 2 corners of that end of the building. And the reason you can see it is because the ceiling is vaulted above that elevation. Normally, that would not have been visible. Some alterations were made to this building that vaulted the ceiling after it was constructed and revealed some of its skeleton in a way that whoever designed it first hadn't really contemplated. Anyhow, at each intersection of a major summer beam going across the building and one massive one going the length of the building right down the center, each of these little blue squiggles is a hand-hewn crook or crotch from a tree. And I couldn't get close enough to any of them because of the plumbing and the critters, but there's an image of one right here. And why I say I couldn't get close enough is I couldn't tell if these dark spots, which are clearly the location of fastenings, are wrought iron fastenings of some kind, or if they're trunnels that are part of the usual wooden peg construction of a building like this. Underneath the floor timbers at critical points where they need to support the weight of the floor, I've used these little blue donuts to represent it. There are these piles of stone. I don't believe these have been moved since the building was built. I mean, look at the structure in those. They're perfect. And they haven't fallen over. The smaller scantlings in blue are what we'll call floor joists. They're like this. They are hand-hewn oak with the bark still on, smooth fully on the underside that meets the floor and only partially on the bottom, which I think is more to ease the handling of the lumber as it was being put together than anything, because oftentimes you'll find the bark goes all the way around something like that on a building. And down below here, we see just evidence, again, one of these little stone piles. This one is one of the joists. There's another joist, and there's one of the summer beams right there. And this end of it, if you follow the outline of the pointer, that's the tag end of one of those crooks. And right there is a dark spot. That's one of the fastening points. I've never seen anything put together quite like that. It's very cool. Oops, I think I just jumped one. Yeah. In the northwest corner of the building, there's a hatch and a closet, thank God. Made life a little easier. But just quickly, you can see one of the wind braces. There are two of these at each corner. They brace each corner post, and they come down to a very strong mortise in the sill. They're part of what helps keep the building rigid. They've been there for a very long time. They're oak. You can also see the inside surface of the exterior planking on the building. It is vertically planked or vertically sheathed, which is an old way of doing things. And there are also cross members such as these, which at interval in the rising wall are mortised into the vertical posts and provide nailing and attachment for the side walling. This is one of the sills. This is an example, like I showed you from Henry Crocker House, of a piece that's reused from another life. These stud pockets, or mortises rather, have no purpose or function in their present location in the building. But this is a load-bearing sill, nevertheless. This is, as I said, the northwest corner, the rubble stone foundation, which in the back of the building is not visible. It's basically almost at grade, so there was no need for brick there, and they didn't use it. This is the intersection of the sill on the west or Rendezvous Lane end and the one on the back or north. And the way the floor system is set up, the floor joists actually sit up on top of the sills rather than being mortised into them, the way they would have been if this, in its previous life, were still serving its original purpose. There would be a mortised joist there with its top surface flush with this sill. In this case, the floor is actually higher than the sills. And in order to accommodate that height on the side walls, they've attached a simple ledger, which isn't really structural. It's just a parking place for the ends of the planks. This is just a little bit of detail, the same thing, looking again at that same northwest corner. This is the ledger board that the planks are parked on. This is the sill on the north side. This is the sill on Rendezvous Lane. You see the gap between the top of the sill and the underside of the floorboards. That's because these floor joists are not let into the sill, they're parked on top of it, and they create a gap that has to be accommodated at the other ends. Again, I think that's a fairly unusual thing I haven't seen before. I don't know if it can be documented or traced to any particular type of builder, but it's possible that that's something that can be used for further research. In the attic, the great revelation of the building to me is the appearance of two extraordinary trusses that, by the scale of the structure, are quite massive. These king posts are probably 10 inches square. They're a mixture of sawn and hewn. Most of the rough lumber in the structure appears to have been created at about the same time by virtue of the saw marks and the coloring on it. There's certainly some exceptions, and those would be where the gable ends were turned up and it was no longer a hip-roof building. There's some new, quote-unquote new, like 1840-something rafters. But this one, the king post, as it's called, is mortised into the meeting point of the two principal rafters. It drops down, and normally a king post would land on a very massive horizontal beam that would go across the building and carry the load of the roof down to that. And then below the summer beam, or excuse me, the tie beam there, would normally be one or two posts down to the first floor level. And that's what we believe this truss was designed to help prevent need of. Because instead of going down and meeting something underneath, it's cut right off. It stops, it's in thin air. and it has a pair of small braces mortised in high on the rafters, juxtaposed to two very, very stout blades that come down at a shallow angle, mortised into the plates at each side, mortised into the king post. And this is the intersection right here. These are the blades. This is the king post. Right there and there you can start to see the upward cant of these two smaller braces. And about a foot below where this picture ends, actually right about there in that photo, is the bottom of the king post. I mean, they're talking about something that weighs a lot, and it's just hanging there. The cool thing is that it's hanging there in a way that is suspended through its bracing to the other parts of the structure. My little final note on the slide is interesting because there are a couple of places in the history of the courthouse, the Third Baptist Society records that talk about repairs being done. And I've begun to speculate that maybe adding this cross plank and some of these wrought iron mending plates was a part of that. I want to kind of move along a little bit here. If I can, oops, sorry, get this stupid thing to work. Here we go. I'm the stupid thing, not it. Again, quick pictures of the vaulted ceiling. Here are rafters that have been put in place because of the change in the roof. Here's the king post top. There's just a close-up of the real thing that you saw in the graphic a moment ago. These are big pieces of material. And in the corner of the plates, each corner of the building, up above here, looking for evidence that there might have been some prior framing that would have supported the hip roof, which would have meant a diagonal rafter coming from the corner up to the center of the roof. In each of the four corners, we found a pocket cut into the two members at 45 degrees, actually, to their intersection, and at an angle that would be a perfect match for something that would rise diagonally up for the hip roof. So I believe those were the landing spots for the hip roof of the building. Probably most of you know about the bell in the belfry here, but one of the things that we did when we scampered up was Kevin photographed it, and Gene looked it up on the internet and started corresponding with people who are experts on this particular foundry. The Meneely Foundry of Troy is one of the most prolific and best known foundries in American history for bell manufacture, and they're quite anxious to get the measurements of this bell and to list it on their archives, which is very cool. But this is indicating, of course, that it was purchased, or excuse me, it was cast in 1850, and that would be about right for it to be available to be hung in the new cupola on the court, what had been the courthouse. This is kind of one of the most exciting discoveries. We're going to wrap up pretty fast here. This is one of the most exciting discoveries that we made, and it was thanks to a tip from a woman at Wellesley College who had done some doctoral research work and stumbled across this at Sturgis Library. And it is not a deed, although it was recorded in there as if it were a deed. It's essentially an invoice or an accounting, and it's dated 1763. And it acknowledges that the county Barnstable is paying wages and is, well, I've got it set up here, but the point is they were already beginning to dispose of the previous courthouse, and these are expenses expended towards the construction of this one. And this pushes the potential date of construction of this building back another decade from what we've all thought for so many years. I think more research needs to be done into the provenance of the document, probably, and to make sure we know who the players are in all of these names that are mentioned. Make sure we can read it correctly. Several of us, Mary and Jean and I, have played with it, trying to interpret it, and it's not that easy, but I think people who are used to transcribing this type of handwriting from this era would have pretty good luck. Oops, sorry. So this is just kind of a summary of what we think we found. And you know, it's what pays off when you take a fresh look at an old building, especially one that's as much loved as this one. But it's not missing, it's right here. That's what I like best, because people would always come up and wonder where it had gone. We think it was built maybe a decade earlier than had previously been thought. No evidence of it having been moved or turned, in the building itself at least, that we can find. And I won't read all of that out loud. It pretty much is a recap of what we've been discussing, but I'm certainly be happy to answer some questions about it in just a little bit or after the talk. I want to be sure to thank some of the people who helped us. This is sort of like the credits that run at the end of a movie. But there's my chief compatriot and colleague in arms there getting ready to jump in the cave. Thank you, Gene, for your help. Your enthusiasm has been awesome. And everybody on that list, and probably one or two we've forgotten to even list, have been tremendously helpful. And I appreciate it very much. Thank you all. You've been a patient audience. Yeah, I know. It's fine.
We have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has any, raise your hand, and I'm sure that Bob will be delighted.
Next week's presentation,
Oh, I don't have a program.
I gave you, it's on the form I gave you.
Oh, okay.
This is all my job.
Oh, next week is Chip Bishop, and he's going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt's son and his Cape Cod connection, and it's going to be on Monday at 7:30. I think that's what it says. Anyway, do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
Drew, hi.
The one on the king post,
Yes.
did you see the type of cutting that was done there, cuts?
No. I mean, where it was terminated? No. There's no clearance. The vault of the ceiling is right up under it, so there's no way. Maybe a mirror that you can put down to see the bottom of your engine in the bilge of your boat or something, and a camera bouncing back would be a way to see it.
Are you convinced that there was no, when it was a courthouse, there were no posts in the center here? Church eliminated them?
I'm pretty convinced, yeah. I would say there isn't anything that I've claimed that I wouldn't cheerfully open to challenge. I mean, that's true of an old building normally anyway. The information's only as good as the eyes looking at it, and the more eyes, the merrier and the better. And posterity is the only way you get the perspective you need to really understand places, and people have been looking at this one for a couple hundred years, so, there's nothing new with that thought. Hi. In this building? I lived next door to it for 11 years, which got me itching and starting, and I knew of it before that. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a neat place, and it's got lots of fun mysteries. Hi.
Justice figure, can you tell if it's been outside, exposed to the elements because of the pitting and things like that versus something that's been inside?
I haven't seen it in person, but Gene and I and others have talked about that from the photographic evidence, and it looks as if it has been weathered. On the other hand, does that mean it was outside in its original position, or does it mean it was outside waiting for somebody to find something to do with it after it had finished its job? There's really no way to be sure about that, unfortunately. That's a good question. I mean, the kinds of testing that can be done on the finishes, on the material, the wood itself in the sculpture, that's true of the trusses in the attic here. It's true of the brick and mortar and the paint on the foundation. I mean, all of these things are eminently available to be further inspected. Some of that stuff is expensive, some of it's not. Some of it can be done with, just a very entry-level, common sense, careful inspection and comparison of things such as we did at the Burgess House about 20 years ago. It didn't cost anything, it just took a lot of time. But if you want to go to the next level of sending paint chips off to Historic New England lab for analysis, you need to have a budget for it, and it gets to be a little more exciting. Yeah.
How many rooms are in the residence that's attached to it?
In this building here?
Yeah.
Well, it's just an apartment upstairs above the parish hall.
Right.
And I think it's 3 rooms deep. I think it's a living room, bedroom, and a bath. That's my recollection from the layout. To tell you the truth, I've never been up there, even though I had a friend who lived there for a few years. It's not large. Somebody over there had a question too? Well, whichever one of you wants to go first, I'm sorry.
Are there any other colonial courthouses in the Bay State that
Great question.
There's one in Plymouth.
in existence?
Well, there's one in Plymouth. There are other colonial courthouses. They are not in New England, to my knowledge, often of this Georgian design. They're apt to be more plain, commonplace colonial frame buildings. The shape that I went looking for, I found down south in brick, in the existing structures at least, which is why those were in the illustrations on the screen. But I haven't spent a tremendous amount of time looking for that. I think there has been some scholarly study done. We do have a couple of books out on interlibrary loan that I went through, I must confess, rather quickly to see if there was any material that would help for this lecture, and I didn't see any buildings that screamed at me that they were comparable. But courthouses and meeting houses were not really often by a prescribed design or pattern book. They often occurred the way they did, including their paint finishes, because the town next door had done it a certain way and they thought it was nice and they did it here too. I mean, that's been documented in the scholarly studies as well. And sort of it makes it a little defeating to try and look too hard because you don't know really what you'll find in terms of its being useful. Yeah, in blue.
Would it be possible to slide a cell phone underneath that?
Not a great idea. Of course it would.
And take a photograph so you could see what kind of markings?
Sure, sure. I wish I had thought of that. I had one in my pocket when I was up there. You know, bang. Good suggestion.
The other thing I wondered is how much of the interior is similar to what would have been here? The benches, I don't know.
I don't think we know much about that.
I can answer that a little bit, Bob.
Great. David, yes.
One of the experts that we met here during the process, some of the railings along the benches most likely were repurposed from the original courthouse.
Okay. There's talk.
And that was based on the patina in the wood, the shape.
Sure. There's some reference in the Third Baptist Society's history of some refurbishing done here that included cherry staining material that might have qualified in that same way, and it would have addressed your repurposing idea too, which was done a lot.
There were any seats in the old courthouses. I think everyone had to stand up.
No, they had seats. I don't know if they did in this one. They did have seats. There was standing room as the predominant space, but there was seating for juries, for participants in the actual transactions at court, and it varies tremendously. The old courthouse in Bristol, Rhode Island has a second floor courtroom, which I had the dubious thrill of doing a measured drawing for a program at Roger Williams years ago. It took forever. It's bigger, a much bigger space than this, but it was a very primitive layout even so. But there were benches. They actually had a stadium seating in it that was very old. Each bench was another 5 or 6 inches higher than the one in front of it. So they vary a lot. We didn't really address the inside. Hi, yes.
Can you ask
Mm-hmm.
me? Do you happen to know when the earliest hip roofs appeared on the Cape?
I do not. The hip roof is a Georgian era feature. So 1600s in Europe, in England, and 1700s here would be my best guess. I'm not certain. It's a good question. They were common in the 1700s here, in the early 1700s. They were particularly common with large scale in public buildings. Yes? She's one of the few people I haven't caught up with about this yet. I know her. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. No, I know her well. She should be on my list and is immediately. Thank you. Yes?
I have two questions, actually. What were the original windows to the room?
I think they were probably in roughly the same locations as these. I don't know for sure what they looked like, and I don't know if we will ever find out. Is Kevin here tonight? Kevin Ryan? No. Oh, yes, he is. Hi, Kevin. I found a picture in my own scrapbook of Henry Crocker House stuff when we lived there. A shot taken across the lane of a gentleman peeling clapboards off or putting new clapboards on the back wall of the building. And it showed quite a lot of sheathing exposed around the windows. And it reminded me, and this nice lady's question reminds me, whenever you're peeling the skin off the apple, take a look at what's underneath and try and write it down, what you find. Even if you're not sure what it means, document it somehow, because it becomes a working body of knowledge that carries forward. I don't know if there would be any ghosting in the vertical planks that would indicate where the original openings for windows had been, but it's possible. It could have been replanked as well. And actually, when we were in the attic, the tops of the planks that were exposed below the plates on each side, on this side appeared to have alternating paint on them, which to me indicated there were replacements. Not so on that side and not so at the gable end. So, I mean, if they've replaced the sheathing, you can't really look for much evidence that way. What was your other question?
The other question was in the underpinnings,
Yes.
the trees, the half trees, had the bark still on them?
Yeah.
What would you estimate was the diameter of those original trees?
The floor joists, which would be the smallest of them and which are the most numerous, are probably about that scale, with my fingers being the flat of the floor. David, do you agree? You've been, well, many of you guys have been down there. Think about that. They vary a lot. The main carrying beams are more like that and have major piles of stone and things under them at key points so that they're well supported.
Some of their bark or just the joists?
Some of them do still have bark on them. I'm guessing most of them had bark on them when they were new here for this building, and some of it has come off. They're different species, they vary, and I don't know which is which. I don't pretend that I do, but you can tell looking at them that they've had sort of different lifespans and histories.
One more question?
Yeah.
Thoreau made the comment in his book that many of the houses on the Cape, they put the windows were not necessarily to look out, but to let light into the room, and so that if they needed a light in a room, they wouldn't necessarily make it symmetrical with the building.
That's probably true. Different periods were more self-conscious about symmetry than others, and different areas were more concerned with it than others. The Cape was a very rural region, agricultural in most respects. You would find some moderately high-style structures in the county seat, such as Barnstable Village, but not a great many. This might have been one of those in its own way and in its own context in the day. But sure, light gathering would be important. Warmth gathering facing the winter sun would be a nice thing. It's traditional. A lot of early buildings were south-facing for that reason. But it varies a lot from locale to locale and period to period.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.